I'm David Clayton, and this is the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture.
This is episode 38, the Way of Beauty podcast. I'm here with Paul Jernberg. Hello again, Paul. We finished off last time, we were talking about the repertoire. I thought we were going to go on to the logistical issues, but in fact, you wanted to talk today about something else, what you call humble artistry in music.
Yes.
Well, humility is always good and artistry is always good. But what are you referring to there?
Right. So I'm not referring to the virtue of humility, which needs to be part of our lives in every aspect. That's certainly needed. But the reason why I put that adjective here is because I think it's absolutely essential to the aspect of artistry in the liturgy, because by the word humble, I mean, first of all, that the music that we sing is always pointing away from ourselves to something greater than itself, namely to the presence of Christ and in the liturgy, and to the word of God as we sing it. So that and also to the right. So we're pointing away from ourselves. We're not, and this is in contrast to lots of other music, most all the other music that we hear or sing, where the focus is naturally on the performer.
Yeah.
So and this can creep in all sort of subtle ways in the liturgy as we sing, that we become that the focus somehow becomes on how wonderful our singing is, but we're always focusing away. Or we might say we're focusing on interiorly also on the presence of God. So that's the first sense in which I feel the word humble is important in terms of the artistry and sacred music. The second reason is that it's by its nature, the essentials of sacred music need to be accessible in humble situations. So that when we talk about we're going to talk about the different aspects of technique and skill, which really are important, but they are at a level that is generally accessible to all sorts of people in all different kinds of contexts. And again, this is in contrast to the sense of needing to have advanced music degrees to be able to do sacred music well. Again, if we look at the traditions east and west, we see that the vast majority of what's been done has been done by people without an elaborate music education, and it's worked, and it's connected, and it's been effective. So those are the two reasons why I'm calling it humble. But then it is artistry, and Pius X brings out this point out in his second characteristic of sacred music, when he says that it needs to be beautiful or have goodness of forms, and then he says, it needs to be true art. So what does he mean, and what does this mean in sacred music? There are a whole set of skills that we need to be able to sing well. These are not, but they're accessible skills, and there is a large overlap with professional training, with what one learns in a conservatory education, and that is, so we have things like diaphragmatic breathing, placement of the voice, resonance, and then on the other hand, we have things like precision of pitch, rhythm, etc. There's a whole set of skills. Many of these are common to both art music or secular music and sacred music. But the basics are, we do need them in the liturgy, and so, but the way in which we use them has this special, has this particular flavor or characteristic of being prayer, and of having a certain intimacy, a certain intensity and interiority to it that is not normally there in secular music, rather.
So just to clarify, you're talking about this artistry, both in this quality of humble artistry, both in the compositional that's imparted to the music by the composer, but then in the performance as well.
Exactly, and that's
both need to be there.
That's right, David. And and so right now, what I just said was a lot about the performance itself. So, in theory, you could have the most wonderful, appropriate sacred music on paper, and then you take that and you don't sing it in the way that it's meant to be sung, and it's not really fulfilling its role.
Right.
It's possible to do Gregorian chant and sacred polyphony, even, as well as other sacred music. It's possible to take what's on the paper and do the notes, and do it correctly in a sense, but it still might miss the point if it's not done with this interiority and this sense of pointing away from itself.
And what strikes me as you're speaking is that one can imagine, for example, if the priest, he's fully visible, he's up front, and he is chanting some aspects of the Mass. And you would say, well, how does he stop being a performer? Well, one is he very clearly addresses God. I would say that ad orientem is probably one way of doing that. In other words, facing the east, facing in the same direction as the congregation. So as we see it, we see his back. But we're all facing in the same direction. But the other thing is that if he is in is praying in his position, then is approaching it in that way, it's an extension of his prayer, then it's more likely to happen. Now we can imagine that occurring with a priest, probably. Now, it strikes me that if that's the case, then why not with choristers as well?
Sure, exactly.
And I'm reflecting on this conversation that we had some time ago about, do they need to be in the gallery behind? Well, the answer is yes, if they are performing. But if they're praying, they can as easily be an example of prayer that is almost a stepping stone between congregation and what's going on in the sanctuary. And in other words, they're the leading members of the congregation in that sense.
Yes. This is for various reasons, this seems to be a very controversial subject at this point.
Yeah.
I think what you're saying makes perfect sense. Now, there is the concern is that one of being discreet and of being of making sure that we're pointing to the action at the altar, and that's one of the arguments for being in the choir loft. And there's something to that, to not draw attention to oneself. But again, my experience has been that it's possible to do exactly what you're saying, and that it's actually that this gets back to the aspect also of what we spoke about of resonance.
Yes.
That music, in order to do its job, so to speak, needs to resonate with the people who are present. It's even though we are addressing it towards God, and God is our primary the object of our prayer, of course, and our love. The love of neighbor is inextricably connected with that. And when we sing in Mass, what we sing needs to resonate with the people. And
yes, I can see that. But the other thing that occurs to me is that the desire to shove the choir at the back, which I'm not saying is necessarily a terrible thing, but what I am saying is it's not a bad thing to have them at the front either if you do it well. Speaks as much about how the congregation see their role as it does about how the choir sees their role. In other words, if everybody is there to pray and to sing and to participate actively, which means interiorly, if that's the phrase, body and soul, then sometimes we're receptive and listening, but we're active as well. And in that sense, the choir is a sort of model for congregational prayer, and therefore ought to be visible if they're doing it well. And I've seen this done in Byzantine churches.
yes,
So you have I don't know if it's ordained, there's a sort of grey area. Blessed might be a better phrase, the position of reader.
yes,
Who is a singer, as a cantor. And so in the choir, you will have the readers and people who are not wearing robes, but they're all there as almost like an extension of the clergy. They're some way between the two. And I was part of the choir, but I'm not a reader, at an Eastern liturgy. And the pastor gave us, we were moved to the front when he felt we were good enough. And he gave us a strong lecture. He said, right now, you are the models of worship for the congregation.
right,
This is how you conduct yourselves.
right.
And we were up front, off to the side, but we're facing forward. We're looking at the sanctuary.
Exactly. And I think that's an essential point. Either looking forward or looking inward. I mean, the traditional position of the choir, of course, is facing inward, right? Which works because then you can also be very much aware of what's going on the altar. But I think one of the things that people have reacted against is when the choir is up front, maybe in the sanctuary, maybe facing everybody.
Yeah.
Then you've got a problem, because then and then add to that the style of the music, and add to that the use of microphones and sound systems, and you have a show that is antithetical to the liturgy. So we need to make really clear that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something entirely reverent and focused, and helping people to enter into the worship of God.
Well, that's the other point, is that when they're there as a model, as an example of congregational worship, rather than priestly, the priests have their role, which is distinct. The invitation there actually is to join in as much as possible, which is desirable, I would say.
Yes, absolutely.
And again, the choice of repertoire is important. That if everything is polyphony, you could do that occasionally. But for the most part, that means you are a spectator. It's very difficult not to be a spectator. Occasionally it works, I would say. And I'm probably reflecting as much my own temperament here. I can see it varies from one person to another. I'm very happy to acknowledge that. But music which is accessible and simple and has a sort of noble form, which can be sung, especially if you're repeating. Of course, how do you learn this? Well, the answer is that some things can be repeated week after week. This is, you have repetition, and maybe you change it for certain parts of the season, but that familiarity is very, very important. Some things are sung every week exactly the same, and then you have full, strong participation.
Right. Yeah. It's good. Can we go back for a moment to technique? because this is something, again, that I just want to reiterate that technique is important.
Okay.
And some people might react against that, but they say, well, come on, this is not a performance center. But having said everything we've said, it's important to sing on pitch, for example. At least for the musicians and for the priests, or at least approximately. One of my very, this is a little bit of a tangent, but one of my favorite singer at our parish is somebody who sings with all his heart, and he's generally off tone, but his song reflects so much his interior intensity of love and worship that I never cease to be edified. So that's sort of the exception to the rule, but I need to say that.
Well, I think that when you have the cantors singing in tune and you have broad congregational participation, these little deviations add a sort of richness that is rather like the mistake of the monk's mistake in the illumination. Actually, it has an authenticity to it. There can't be so much that the whole thing is just veering off out of tune, but that sort of variation adds to it. And I'm assuming that this person, as you were speaking, we had a friend. This is just a little story, but we used to. It's the desire to chant. Everyone says that English people won't sing, for example. We have this choral tradition. But, you go to a football match and listen to the singing, and you realise that the instinct is there.
Yes.
And for men to sing heartily. Now, in football matches, I'm talking soccer games, he probably doesn't bear repetition, most of the language, but the desire is there. But we used to sing in the car when we were going to events, and we'd sing along to things that were played on the sound system in the car, you can imagine us doing. And there was one guy we used to joke, he was so off tune that actually he was accidentally harmonizing with us. That's we encouraged him. And I always thought of that, but it never occurred to us to tell him to shut up or anything.
Right.
But we used to rib him a bit. But the thing that strikes me is that as far as possible, you need that lead from those who are tuneful and powerful, and in such a voice, one imagines, which probably means male voices predominantly. And again, you tell me that people can join in with.
That's right. And before we talk about the male voice here, I just want to harp for a moment on the aspect of some other basic needs. And this is for your cantor, for your choir, especially. And they need to be able to sing in tune.
Yeah.
My friend, who's my favorite singer, would not work as a cantor. So we need to sing in tune. There needs to be clarity of diction. There needs to be resonance, good resonance in his voice. And there also needs to be a freedom from stylish singing, you might say. In other words, if I start singing in a way that is sort of a pop way of singing, that in itself will be a distraction to people. There needs to be
or operatic, one imagines. That would be a deviation as well.
Exactly. And that's included. So you have to, that's a negative thing that's very important. That now it doesn't mean that the voice is bland. It still needs to be alive and warm, but it should not have any hint of being what's the word? Not merely a performance, but you might say a sophisticated performance in which the aesthetic is the primary concern. The primary, when we hear this, the cantor, when we hear the priest, the deacon, there should be a sense of a certain interiority and prayer that are expressed through that, and a certain naturalness. And to the extent that we make it, we refine our voices so that it's as if we're on a stage singing for a concert, there's a problem.
Mm. Yes, I know exactly what you mean. It's one of those things, when you hear it, you know it.
Yeah.
And it's having a natural voice. Of course, that makes it easier to hear as well, doesn't it?
That's right.
Perceive the words that are being sung.
Right, right. Now, in all this too, I need to say that we're at a work in progress too. So, in any given parish situation, if we need to realize that the people that we might be working with, it's going to take some time to get all this down. And we might have somebody who does have a seemingly very operatic voice, but they're the person we've got.
Yeah.
And we've got so there's a lot of prudential judgments here, and there's also a question of being grateful for what we have. But having said that, yes, we need to head towards that natural tone. That's
okay.
Yeah.
Now, can we come to the male voice? Can
yes.
we say yes?
Yeah. So this again, the fact is just that I've been associated with many wonderful female cantors, and some of you might be listening right now, and I'm very grateful for everything. And what you do is often an inspiration to me. Having said this, the ideal is the male voice for cantoring. Why? Because for men to have a full congregation of men and women, men in the congregation will respond much easier to the male voice. They'll be able to follow the male voice, and women will be able to do it also. But if there's a woman cantor, even if she's brilliant, it's often difficult for men to follow the pitch because it's so much higher. And men almost feel like they have to go up like this very high. They have to bring their voice up so high that it feels unnatural to them. Now, if you have a very good musician, that's going to be different. They're going to say, okay, I'm singing down an octave, no problem. But for the normal parishioner, having a woman cantor is going to mean that we're going to have a lot of men struggling to sing their parts.
And that's borne out by experience, I think. If you look at the congregations where this is what you have, and the same applies, I think, also to highly stylized cantoring as well, even if it's men. If they stand up to an operatic aria for,
right.
And then you're supposed to follow with "Lord have mercy" or something.
Yeah.
People just won't join in. But I see that men just would stand there with their hands in the pocket and just assume it's not for them to be singing.
Right.
Very often.
And this is like really important. That we have men who are leading the way, and as well as women. But it's not if our singing in the Mass is primarily a feminine thing, that I think that's a problem. And if it's both masculine and feminine, then there's a completeness to it.
And the point about this is that the male cantor is naturally an invitation to both men and women, and it's because of the qualities of the voice. It's easier. A woman can join in with a man, whereas it is difficult, just technically difficult, for a man to join in with a woman.
Right.
Aside from any other sort of, psychological things that men don't like to be led by women, whether we think that's right or wrong, that tends to be the case. But if we put all that aside, there's a technical aspect there, which just really is primarily the point, that female cantors cut out men, most men.
That's right. Now there's another aspect here too, even for male cantors, and that is that there's a certain range in which both high voices and low voices among men can sing easily. So for those who have bass voices, it's generally important to sing a little bit higher than their normal comfort range, but not too high. And for tenors or high baritones that have an easy time singing high, they need to be careful not to sing too high for a similar reason, so that there's this sort of an ideal range which we need to have as a general parameter for our singing.
Right. Okay. Anything else on this topic, do you think?
Of artistry. I think that I would like to affirm the value of vocal training, good vocal training. In itself, it's something that is really a great experience for so many of us who have had the opportunity to do it, as far as just learning how the voice works, learning about breathing from the diaphragm, learning about placing the voice, about resonance, and so forth and so on. And there's lots more to it. There's a lot in there that it's about discovering our natural equipment, you might say, and there's but that the limit, so that in that sense, it's something really good and important, and that can take place also in the context of choir rehearsals, which I've done all along, trying to help students to realize these basic principles of voice technique. But then again, in the liturgy, we just need to be aware of the fact that there are certain limits that we need to respect in order to be liturgical and not go over into another style.
That's one of those things that if you really want to understand, if you're listening to this thing, what are you talking about? Well, okay, I understand these distinctions, but
so we almost need to get
you recognize the difference, because instantly you think, well, I can sing along with that, I can hear the words.
That's right.
It'll be the one that naturally people gravitate towards if they're interested in joining in a sense.
Yeah, and we almost need to have we almost need to do some actual singing here to demonstrate with a group of people.
Yeah.
That at another point, but because these are, again, even though it might seem a little abstract just to hear us talking about it, it's very objective, and it's something that we could do a class. I mean, this is what I do all the time with my choirs, and there's a definite concreteness, objectivity to these things in practice.
I have one question actually that and it might just be my hearing, but I find it easier if I'm listening to a male cantor to tell what the words are generally, and it might be just with the ones I'm hearing, I don't know. But you can have beautiful female singers, and I can't hear the words very often. Am I just unlucky, or is there some sort of inherent quality in the voice again, which is making it more difficult for women to be understood?
Yeah, that's difficult for me to answer because I'm not really sure. I know that there have been studies that show that different people can hear certain pitch ranges.
Okay, all right. That might be it.
Not only in getting older, but just normally, that we have different pitch ranges at which we function more easily in listening. But you bring up a really good point, because I would say what I am aware of is, both for men and women, there's a way to sing that can be very clear without being affected.
Yeah.
That's very important to cultivate. And this is very important, and it's sometimes not, you don't find it in cantors and choirs. We need to understand the words, and so that's something. Now, also, when I'm directing choirs, my choristers will tell you that one of the things I'm always telling them is you have to exaggerate the diction when you sing, in church especially, because it's not as if you have a microphone. You shouldn't have, I hope you do not have a microphone in front of you. But the thing is, if you do not exaggerate the diction to a certain extent, you will not be understood. And especially in a church with a live acoustic.
Yes.
But it's really important now. But you can see how that exaggeration of the diction could take you to do sort of an unnatural way too. So you have to be careful for that as well. So there's different elements here, but diction is so important. So that's all. I don't know.
Okay.
I didn't really answer your question about the.
Well, no. I mean, if it's what you're saying, it seems to me is that it's perfectly possible for good women singers to be understood in your experience.
I believe it is, David.
Yeah. Okay.
And,
yeah. Good.
And yeah.
All right. I think that we can finish there. Actually, have we exhausted that point for the moment?
For the moment. Now, of course, each one of these things, it's we're talking about a year or 2 or 3 of coursework to actually develop this art. For church musicians, there's a lot you can work on and go deeper with, and continue to develop. But I think we've covered most of the points.
Right. Okay, well, until next time, we'll say goodbye, Paul. Thank you very much for this. Extremely interesting as ever.
Thank you, David.
And we'll talk to you again.
Sounds good.
Goodbye.
You've been listening to the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture. If you enjoyed this episode, then please give us a 5-star review on iTunes. This will help others to find it too. Also, if you're interested in delving more deeply into the material that we discuss, you can do a course at the Pontifex University website. That's pontifex.university.